the reemergence of industrial policy in America is, I would say, 100% about China.
Beijing decided it does not really want to look too much like the US. And rather, Beijing has this purely mercantilist view of let's just make a ton of shit. And that is our source of power. That is our source of advantage.
I mean, the world, the 1940s and 1950s that was bequeathed to us by the New Deal age was truly disgusting. I mean, the rivers were disgusting and the air was disgusting.
Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson need no introduction. Dan Wang wrote all those beautiful annual letters and is back in the US, a research fellow at Kotkin's Hoover History Lab, and has an absolute banger of a book called Breakneck coming out this August. I've read it, it's superlative, but we're saving that show for a little later this year. Today, we are talking abundance, China, technocratic versus prophetic theories of change, podcasting and writing, and being in public writing about policy in 2025. Welcome to ChinaTalk, everyone.
Thank you. I want whatever coffee you're drinking. I want to bring this enthusiasm to the show.
Just inject it into my veins, Jordan.
I am like the most embarrassingly sober person you have ever come across. I didn't even have tea for this because I was worried. All right. I want to start with a line from Ezra's show with Tom Friedman. Friedman said, whether I'm writing about China from Washington or whether I'm writing about China from China, I'm always just writing about America. My goal is to use China as my permanent Sputnik. So Ezra, you mentioned over email that initially there was more China in abundance, but in the final text, I think it primarily just plays that Sputnik role too. So question for both of you guys, what do we lose when policymakers and policy advocates treat China primarily as a rhetorical device rather than a complex object of study?
Those feel a little bit like two questions to me. One reason that abundance is not heavily about China is that I think, I won't speak for Derek, for myself, I am perfectly aware I don't understand China. What I do understand is the gravity that China exerts on American politics. And, you could call it a Sputnik moment, but I would call it a competitor. That China, we have a very complex relationship of antagonism, competitiveness, and envy with China. And I think going back to at least the 2010s, probably before, I've begun to really notice this feeling that exists in American politics that they can build and we can't. And that became a pathway through which different kinds of bipartisan legislation that would not otherwise have been bipartisan began to emerge. The reemergence of industrial policy in America is, I would say, 100% about China. That you take China out of the equation and there is no reemergence of American industrial policy. And so I think that it is reasonable from the American perspective, when you're trying to understand American politics, to understand China as an American political object, because I think that's really the thing that it actually is. As that kind of conversation with Tom Friedman suggested, I don't think American policymakers understand China really at all. And in fact, I think that probably most of what they think about it has a very high chance of proving to be dangerously misguided. I mean, Dan will be much more expert here than I will, but I'm very skeptical of the bipartisan consensus that has emerged. But it's nevertheless a completely trackable thing that China exerts a force on American politics. It has reshaped the American political consensus, often in ways that operate a little bit in the shadows because they don't become part of the major fights of partisan fights of kind of modern American politics.
The only thing I would add there, because I also don't think I understand China, and this was primarily a book about trying to deeply understand not all of America, but for some very specific questions about America. Why can't America build houses? Why can't America build clean energy? What's wrong with America's invention agenda? Right? Very narrow questions about this country. And so the book's scope did not include some deep dive into deeply understanding Chinese industrial policy or the nature of Chinese politics. The only thing that I would add is just to say that, my interest in China is one of relatively blue sky curiosity. I think it's interesting that we have this term, the Thucydides trap, which explains the waves of history where over and over again, when you have a dominant political or geopolitical power, and there's a new rival, that new rival discombobulates the status quo power. But there's a way in which modern American history has demonstrated something more like not necessarily the Thucydides trap, but like the Thucydides stimulus, the idea that when a new rival emerges, it can inspire the existing superpower to think a little bit differently. Sometimes that Thucydides stimulus comes through a sense of geopolitical threat. Like, I am very interested in the history of Sputnik and the way that the Sputnik moment and the Sputnik satellite itself inspired all sorts of things about American policy in the 1950s, 1960s. But there's also an approach you could take that isn't one of fear of geopolitical threat, but rather one of rather open curiosity. How does China build its trains so quickly? How does China build so many bike paths that are so beautifully sewn into the environment, as I've not only read from Dan's work, but I think maybe also seen from Dan's photography? What are the different ways in which the Chinese versus American politicians think about designing their society such that each could learn from the other? So, without traipsing on that bridge, too dangerously far and taking away from Dan's wonderful book, which we are not going to talk about today, I do think that there's a way to engage with this idea of the Thucydides stimulus that isn't exclusively motivated by fear, but is rather motivated by a kind of open curiosity.
All right, I'm going to throw it to Dan, but I just love how this, your response to my first question shows that you guys are the masters and I'm still the students. I was debating like a whole week which my first question should be, and then I just gave it to OpenAI and I was like, all right, squish these two together and like, we'll see which one they go for. So you seeing through that, it's very impressive. All right, Dan.
Well, I would always be the first person to put my hand up to say I know nothing about what's going on in China. I think that is always true.
Welcome to ChinaTalk, where nobody knows anything about China.
Well, Jordan knows something about China. Here he is.
Less than Dan, Jesus Christ.
I think that China is very messy. That is my first proposition always about China. It is very big. And all things are true about China all at the same time. They are a country that call themselves to be pursuing socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is still one of the most wonderful terms, I think, ever in anything related to political science. And, what sort of socialism is this? In my view, this is one of the most right-wing regimes in the world, a country that would make any American conservative salivate in terms of its immigration restrictions, in terms of having an incredible amount of manufacturing prowess, in terms of enforcing very traditional gender roles in which men have to be very macho and women have to bear their children. And so China is these things. It is also a place where Shanghai is made up of really wonderful bike paths. This year they have completed, I believe, 500 parks, and by 2030 they want to create 500 more parks. It is a country that is getting better and getting worse all at the same time.
Well, one thing that makes me think about, and I think we should mainly just ask Dan questions, is that it goes back to this idea of envy. It is fascinating to me the degree to which the right envies China. It doesn't just want to compete with it. It doesn't just want to beat it. It doesn't want to, it's not just afraid of it. What it wants is to be more like it. And in wanting to be more like it, it is right now, I think, overlooking virtually every advantage and competitive strength America itself has. So I think a very good way of thinking about this is that there's been a series of papers and arguments that China and America as the two, current superpowers both have a huge advantage, and this paper calls it a hegemony, but I'm not sure if that's quite the right term, over something the rest of the world needs. In America's case, it's the financial system. In China's case, it's manufacturing. And America's politicians are so obsessed with trying to take manufacturing back from China, which I don't think they have a well thought through approach to doing, that they look quite ready to give up America's financial power. They seem to have reconceived of dollar dominance, which used to be called the exorbitant privilege, because we got so many privileges from it as some sort of terrible weakness that has hollowed out our industrial base and that we need to sort of shatter. The sense of sort of finance as being something that we export to the world, services. I think in all of history, being the power that controls the money flows has proven to be an extraordinary lever of control. But I think it has been recast in current new right thinking as a sort of feminized decadence, right? Something that not real countries and not real powers do, a distraction from the real economy and the real work of making things. And I'm not against bringing back, I support the CHIPS Act. There's a lot of things in manufacturing that I would like to bring back. But we can become so envious that it becomes hard to see our own advantages and strengths and then make sort of serious policy built off of what we are doing and what we don't want to stop doing, what we want to build on. And that strikes me as one of the really profound weaknesses of the way that Washington is thinking about policymaking. It is so obsessed with what we are not doing well that it seems ready to light on fire what we are doing well.
Edward Luttwak has this term, great power autism, which he created in terms of the US thinking about the Soviet Union. And I think there is certainly an aspect. Once you are a quote unquote superpower, you start being obsessed with the other party, and you have to start thinking about what are you actually after, because you have to choose your enemies very carefully because you will end up looking quite a lot like them. I wonder in which way the US is actually quite mimetic and thinking about how do we be like the other superpower. Because in my sense, China, after you can date it to around 2008 with the financial crisis, maybe you can date it to 2012 when Xi came into power. But Beijing decided it does not really want to look too much like the US, which has been driven so much by Wall Street on the one coast and Silicon Valley on the other in terms of a lot of its economic growth. And rather, Beijing has this purely mercantilist view, which is recognizable to anyone in the 18th century of let's just make a ton of shit. And that is our source of power. That is our source of advantage. And maybe we'll get a lot better here.
Maybe now's the time to bring up Goertzel, which is a book that you've been shouting out a lot of late, Ezra, with his argument basically being that the Soviet Union as mimetic object is something that facilitated a big, a long 20th century of liberal governance, starting all the way, people don't date it to, the 1940s, date it to 1917 with Lenin and all of the sort of like progressivism that unlocked. And, we have Eisenhower buying into Social Security and also domestic politics and the role of the USSR in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. And it's interesting because like there's a little bit of that with like a Todd Young and a Mike Gallagher trying to do the like different version of self-strengthening than the one that is the one that's dominant in the White House today. But I'm curious what sort of like lessons from the Soviet Union in how it shaped and how the Soviet Union sort of like shaped American politics. What are the sort of different futures that could look like in the US over the next few decades?
So Gary Gerstle, the Cambridge historian, has this beautiful theory of political orders, which says that there are eras in American politics that are essentially defined by both an internal conflict and an external threat. An internal conflict and an external threat that together create a kind of consensus that exists between the parties that lasts for decades, even as there are sort of headline disputes that make it seem like the parties are at each other's throats. And sometimes the parties are at each other's throats. So the two big political orders are the 1930s, the 1960s, 70s, which is the New Deal order, the internal crisis, initial internal crisis being the Great Recession, the external threat being the rise of communism and socialism around the world, and particularly in Europe. And the New Deal order essentially synthesized those ideas by responding to the Great Depression and softening the introduction of socialism to American politics by creating this political order that was much more expansive in terms of an aggressive and muscular domestic policy, spending to reduce unemployment and poverty with the Social Security Act, employing millions of people. And as you said, Dwight Eisenhower in many ways acquiesces to that political order in the 1950s. He is a very, very strong advocate of social welfare policies. He's a very strong proponent of continuing to build in America. He builds the highway system. But in the 1970s and 1980s, you have a breakdown of that order, where instead of the Great Recession, you have stagnation in the 1970s. And instead of this sort of spectral threat of socialism in Europe, you have the direct threat of the Soviet Union in its capacities in the 1970s. And so this new political order comes up that's defined by individualism rather than by a kind of collectivism of the New Deal era. And Gerstle calls this the neoliberal order. And the neoliberal order essentially reigns over American politics between the 1980s and roughly the 2010s. And it's Gerstle's theory, and I think Ezra and I have subscribed to this idea, that you've seen a decline and even a fall in that neoliberal order. There are problems today that cannot just be solved by just trying to cut taxes or trying to embrace a kind of Reaganite conservatism. The problem of housing scarcity or the problem of the fact that we can't build sufficient clean energy, the problem problems we're facing in building the technology that we invent in the U.S., these are not problems that can just be solved by merely cutting taxes and deregulating some things at the national level. We need more specific solutions to those problems. And abundance liberalism is sort of our answer to those new problems. And I think it's an answer that essentially, in a way, tries to synthesize the best of the New Deal order and the neoliberal order. The New Deal order taught us about the power of government to intervene and to see what markets themselves cannot see. And then the neoliberal order, I think, sometimes at its best saw that in some ways government bureaucracy can get in its own way. And we're trying to advance a theory of progressive governance that sees the ways in which it creates rules for itself that make it harder to achieve its outcomes. And so I think abundance liberalism really, tries to find a way to, advance a muscular theory of government that says we can build houses, we can build clean energy, we can do extraordinary things with technology, but in many ways that requires identifying the way that we've written rules that get in our own way.
Derek, why fold in neoliberalism into this big package? Why not just embrace the New Deal agenda, in a classical flavor? When I think about the New Deal, I think about construction of a lot of power plants, construction of quite a few homes, as well as a lot of broader infrastructure. We'll pack the courts if necessary, because that was part of the agenda. What are we adding with the neoliberal flavor here?
Well, when I say we're adding with a neoliberal flavor, what I basically just mean is that there were insights made in the 1970s and 1980s about failures of the New Deal order that were accurate diagnoses, right? For example, the New Deal order built and built and built, often without any consideration for either the voice of the marginalized or the poor, or for the environment. And as a result, one legacy of the New Deal order is that the amount of construction was partially responsible for creating a groundswell against the state, against the growth machine, that empowered this kind of legalistic revolution of the 1960s and 1970s that we now see strewn across the country. We see it in NEPA, we see it in CEQA, we see it in the procedural fetish, we see it in adversarial legalism at many different levels of government. We are in many ways a society that is defined by a kind of very activist lawyer class. So I think it's important to look at history and recognize that there were legitimate legal responses to the growth machine that happened in the 1960s, 1970s. The other part is environmentalism. I mean, the world, the 1940s and 1950s, that was bequeathed to us by the New Deal age was truly disgusting. I mean, the rivers were disgusting and the air was disgusting. The tailpipe emissions from our cars were choking the planet. And so it really was important to pass a series of environmental rules to essentially allow growth that was cleaner. And we succeeded in so many ways. The air is cleaner and the water is cleaner and the tailpipe emissions are significantly lower than they were. But I think now we need a new kind of synthesis because the problems of climate change are not the environmental problems of the 1940s, 1950s. We need ways to build clean energy that can allow people to live modern lives without choking the biosphere. And so that's why I think we need a new synthesis and not a return to the 1930s. The very last thing that I would say here, when people sometimes say or sometimes ask, as you did, why can't we just roll back the clock and make it 1932 again? The government in 1932, in responding to the the Great Depression, hired millions and millions of people through the Works Progress Administration. The U.S. government, with its deficit and today's interest rates, not to mention the political climate, simply doesn't have the ability to hire 5 million people to just build the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's just not going to happen. So in many cases, in order to build, whether it's houses or energy, infrastructure, transit, we need the private sector to do that building, which means in many ways we need to build a legal architecture that allows the private sector to build without despoiling the planet or running roughshod over consumer or environmental interests.
So I think I understand kind of where you're coming from in a Iraq war hangover of if there is this much of a consensus, then maybe there's something fishy here. But I guess I am a little frustrated, and maybe this is a broader frustration with the show as it's evolved to turn into Jordan Media Critic, is it seems like it's evolving less to let's learn about a field than let's book someone to let Ezra make a point. And, having, over the past 5 years, Tom Friedman, Jessica Chen-Weiss, and of course, Dan. But the show you did with Dan wasn't really about Chinese foreign policy. I think is like, very much leaning on one side of a professional community where like it is now split sort of like 90-10 in the other direction. So I guess, you got a big platform, Ezra. I'm curious sort of like how you feel about, maybe this is even a broader question than the dovishness of like how you feel about like weighing in versus like interrogating on policy questions that aren't like directly in your bailiwick.
One pattern I notice in media criticism is people feel you are not using your platform in a curious enough way when they disagree with it. But when they agree with it, they actually find it to be plenty curious. And so I get this from all kinds of different perspectives.
Okay. Fair.
Look, when I think the consensus is wrong, my show goes counter consensus. So when I thought Joe Biden was too old to be running again, and most people thought, hey, the primary's settled, I was willing to take a lot of heat for saying, hey, I don't think Joe Biden should be running again. I think Democrats should have an open convention. And in this particular case, I think the ambient even coverage of China on my show, except for a couple of cases where I've had very specific China episodes, which I think there have only been 3 or 4, it reflects a lot of the broadly speaking Washington consensus, which is that we need a lot of industrial policy to recapture major industrial sectors back from China. But yes, like I think that I think the thing that worries me most, and I've covered Washington for a long time, is when I feel that things are becoming unsayable without there being really good evidence for why they shouldn't be said. And I don't mean within the professional China debate community. I mean within the political community of people who need to win elections and advance their political careers. And I don't think I'm a dove in the sense that I think there's no problems in the Chinese Communist Party. But I am not sure the relentless buildup of, antagonism and ever harsher policies is working, or we are even evaluating if they're working. So on the one hand, I don't think my show is so unwilling to give air to that. I had Ben Buchanan on AI policy and Jake Sullivan on, and he talked about China policy. And these are all people defending, right, the sort of effort to deny China certain kinds of technological exports that will allow them to attain a leadership space. At the same time, Tom Friedman's point, which again, I guess you could call dovishness, but is one that there's a tendency in Washington to be competing with the China 15 years ago and not recognize how much manufacturing innovation they're currently capable of, and to believe that we simply wall ourselves off from them or engage in some kind of trade war with them, we're going to win. And we're going to rebuild this manufacturing sector that they have built painstakingly over this period of time. And it's just not clear to him, and it's just not clear to me. Maybe it's clear to you. I'd actually like to hear you defend it if you think it is. That tariff policy in some sort of structure like what we're currently doing, I mean, because that's what that show is about, is going to achieve that goal. But more broadly, I don't know, is it so bad for the world if China makes a lot of solar panels and EVs, and if you believe that climate change is as big of a problem as I believe it is, that rapidly accelerates the renewable and the dispersion of renewable energy in electric vehicles? I understand why the Biden administration came down where it did. I'm not even sure I think they're wrong. But I would like to hear the other side of that argued a little bit more publicly than I tend to seem to hear it. And similarly, in things like AI governance, is the race dynamic that has emerged between us a good thing? If you have worries about AI safety, and even as it's become a little bit gauche to have them, I still have them. I think the fact that the two countries are basically willing to throw out every other concern they have in order to beat the other one to the goal of some kind of usable AGI should make you pretty concerned about the structure of development that is now emerging on both sides. So I just don't see the preconditions here for wise policymaking. And I think that the absence of those preconditions is one reason the Trump administration, in its careening, absurd effort to construct some kind of tariff policy that makes sense, retreated from all-out trade war with the entire world to all-out trade war with China. They thought that would be more defensible, but did they plan for it? Have they thought through the outcomes of it? Like, I guess I would turn this question.
I feel like these are.
I guess I would turn this question back on you, Jordan, a little bit. Do you think where the U.S.-China conversation has gone is leading us towards good policy?
I mean, like, obviously not, but I feel like that's a bit of a straw man. You're like asking me to defend Trump's tariffs. I mean,
but hold on. I want to push this because you brought it up. The Friedman conversation is about Trump's tariffs. It's a view that we are getting to the policies we're getting to because of the views that have begun to take hold, at least in the Republican Party, about China. I don't see I don't see which part of that is weak.
The bone I have to pick is that Jake Sullivan and Ben Buchanan are not people who've spent a lot of time reading party documents. And I think the sort of fundamental to all of this is like understanding the system and its intentions, because it is relatively equal to the US from a national power perspective and is going to be so for the coming decades, like regardless of what we do about it. So sort of understanding the broader system is like a very important like intellectual substrate that folks like deserve to be rigorously interrogated. And I don't think Tom Friedman spending a week at Huawei campus is necessarily going to give you that. So,
but this is a trade, but that's a trade policy conversation. So what would change in your trade policy from understanding their objectives? Because let's have the conversation here then, right? I don't think we should be too abstract. Okay. I agree that my show has not dug into party documents. I mean,
sure,
there's reasons I haven't done that, but whatever, we haven't done it. But in terms of what we're trying to interrogate on my end, which is the sort of output of U.S. policy here and whether or not it's going to work to achieve our goals, what do you think is being missed? What is the premise here that needs to be inserted?
All right, what are we missing? I mean, I think we're missing that the world is has the potential to go in a direct, like, I mean, it's like more difficult in the context of Trump, because I am not sure that like China being a boogeyman is the thing that is like empowering Trump to do what he does. I mean, like, yes, I guess at some levels it helped him get elected. But I feel like he could say whatever he wanted and like he would do that because he has this, hypnotic control of the Republican Party. So I don't know. I'm feeling.
I guess I'm not sure.
This is why I was scared of this show, Dan, because like I don't have guests who are podcast hosts who are just gonna throw this stuff back at me.
Can I ask a version of the question?
Yeah.
Like, let's say that I am Derek, modal Ezra Klein show listener. Okay. And I just mainline Ezra's show, and his ideas are well articulated and dulcet toned, and they just become my ideology. What is my ideology missing right now as it regards China?
That it is a like ideologically driven system, and the world in which China is able to more dramatically kind of like reshape the global balance of power over a 15-year horizon is one that we should be really concerned about.
How?
Particularly like, at least in the sort of like Xi era, which we're not entirely sure when it ends, but I have like I think maybe this is when I get to bring Dan in here to talk about sort of like the broader community of people who think about this, like, are very uncomfortable in the world in the timeline where kind of like America truly is waning relative. America and its friends are waning relative to China on a sort of like multi-decadal horizon. So I wasn't super happy with how that came out. So here's my one line a day later. It is not possible to know with a high degree of confidence what China really wants, but there's at least a 25% chance that the Chinese government we get in the coming decades is a deeply Leninist and expansionary one. And that is a scary timeline that the world needs to price in and prepare for. So that's for the modal Ezra listener. And then maybe for the modal DC Hawk, just that Chinese people are people too.
I definitely want to defend the dulcet tones of both Ezra as well as Derek. But I think, as an amateur member of the community of China watchers, I think there are some debates that are not really easy to resolve in terms of, what are these questions out there? For example, a question that I would pose to U.S. policymakers would be, do you judge it is in America's interest that China is richer? Or is America better off that China is poorer? And, having that sort of answer would help structure a lot of subsequent policy choices. I think there is debate within the China community. How expansionist is China? They certainly want Taiwan. There's no question there. But is the next step that they want to take Vietnam, Philippines, as well as Japan? And so that is a question where the people are extensively debating. And so when we can answer these sort of more technocratic questions where we may get closer to coming to an answer and have some sort of agreement there, a lot of things become easier. And I feel like, this is not thing to do with Ezra's show, but I feel like in the US, there are just not that many experts really trying to debate and come to a resolution of these types of questions. Now, certainly in the field that I have been studying, Chinese technology development as well as manufacturing, I certainly feel like the policymakers are out there throwing out the laziest tropes, that China got to exactly where it has, totally through stealing. And I think that is easily disprovable, but that is something that we are hearing all the time. And so long as we're not able to move beyond these sorts of tropes, then it becomes much more difficult to resolve even the harder questions.
I guess to me, this is sort of, it's funny because I definitely did not expect to come on the show and try to articulate like my own quite weak philosophy of China. But this goes back to what Tom was saying, what I've said sort of too in the book, which is that this is a way of talking about America. So Jordan, I guess if the disagreement you think you have with me is that I am excited for a world in 15 years where America has weakened substantially and China has reshaped the global order.
Like the prompts that Dan raised are worthy.
Well, I am not. So let me set your mind at ease. That as dulcet as my tones may be, I don't want that world. What I do want is a world where we are trying to achieve our goals through policy aims that make sense. And so I guess one of the places where I have been very, my views are actually quite weak on a lot of these things. There are things where I have very strong views, right, about how America should and why it should build more and faster. And a bunch of the book Derek and I wrote is, fundamentally, as we say at the end, somewhat motivated by competition with China and a view that we are not going to be able to continue thriving as a nation in terms of our own strength if we do not get better at manufacturing, at construction, at deployment, at innovation, and at this kind of cyclical way of doing experimental policy than we have been. There's something for us to learn there and compete with there. I guess on the more narrow level of this, I think that there's been a view that has taken hold in Washington that some version of decoupling is the way forward. And one place where I just have been uncertain that I agree with it, not certain that I disagree with it, but it is so dominant that I'm more interested in the counter argument than I am in the conventional argument, is, Tom's argument from the Huawei campus and from other things he has seen and done is that we should do with China in the 2020s what we did with Japan in the 1980s and 1990s when they were sort of outcompeting us on cars, and actually do these joint ventures in America where we begin to develop their kind of technological and manufacturing processes and embed them in our own companies. Very much something China did with us too. Now that is in Washington considered something you basically cannot say. I think it's something that at least I would like to hear a better argument than I've heard against it, because it does not seem obvious to me that what we're doing now is going to accelerate the sophistication of our manufacturing chains. And so I guess I think that my view is similar to Dan's, which is I would like us to have much more precise conversations about means and ends. But I think it is hard to do in terms of a generalized atmosphere where the politics are you kind of have to outcompete to be atmospherically tough or symbolically tough. or hawkish. Now, the Taiwan problem, like the Indonesia question, right? Those are all both, I think, very, very severe and somewhat beyond my ability to know what to think about them.
Yeah.
I think in terms of questions that America has a very, very unclear internal view on, would we actually go to war to defend Taiwan is a very clear one where we have a kind of, people don't want to answer that. And I don't even know what I think the answer should be. But in terms of what do we need to do to accelerate our manufacturing and innovative ecosystems, I think this idea of, I think the question of whether or not we should be decoupling or trying to actually couple and do tech transfer and be in more direct competition with things like Chinese EVs, while heavily subsidizing, and having real goals for our own industries, I mean, it doesn't seem completely crazy to me.
So I think maybe the sort of distinction between the technocratic and the prophetic. And I think once things turn into this US China, World War III prophecy, that's I think where all of us get frustrated. But in particular, the way you guys talked about abundance, you both started way on the sort of technocratic side of writing. And I think there's, a little more how Frederick Douglass, MLK, let's make this vision and assign some sort of moral force behind it in order to turn it into something that goes from, policy jestings to something that really is rhetorical and resonates. I'm curious, how you think about the sort of broader theories of policy change of technocratic versus prophetic voices, and how you tried to grapple with that in framing the book and then talking about it on the big media tour.
Sure. The book is both poetry and prose, right? We have an introduction and a conclusion that have sentences that I think we describe to each other, at least I describe to Ezra, as aphoristic and epigrammatic, sentences that wanted to be underlined, sentences that wanted to have that glow on it when you're reading it on Kindle. That's 10,000 people have underlined this sentence, right? In a weird way, it's strange to write for that piece of coding to become illuminated in the text. But there's a way in which that's writing in a mimetic way, right? That's a very 2025 way of talking about how to write mimetically. We want to write sentences that people will quote, that people will remember and underline and highlight. And we want to use terms that will infect the software of people's minds, right? People talk about everything vague liberalism. People talk about an abundance agenda. And I don't think Ezra or I are trying to be shy about simultaneously wanting aspects of this book to be highly mimetic, while other aspects of this book are admittedly and even painstakingly technical, right? The analysis of Tahanan, the affordable housing complex in San Francisco, or the analysis of notice of funding opportunities for chips, or the analysis of the history of the NIH in America, the analysis, the history of the development of solar technology. These are highly technical sections that I hope to speak to the fact that we're not just trying to be pie in the sky poets here. We really want to understand how the world works, how government works, because there's no way to understand how to make it work better without understanding the thing in the first place. So that's what I would say in terms of the writing of the book. I've gotten the question over and over again in the podcast tour and the live speaking tour. How do we expect this book to make contact with, say, the 2026 midterms, the 2028 presidential election cycle? And my feeling, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again because I really deeply believe in it. Nobody votes for books. No one votes for books. And even in American history, where you could even lightly make the argument that the president was influenced by a book, they're still voting for that person. People vote for people, right? FDR, right? People didn't elect John Maynard Keynes in 1932. They elected someone who was inspired by Keynes. No one elected Milton Friedman in 1980, but Ronald Reagan was inspired by Milton Friedman. And the way that I think about the job of writers, podcasters, public intellectuals is in a crisis, and crises will come. They will come maybe in this decade twice as fast as they've come in previous decades. When crises come, people in power reach for the ideas that are on the shelf around them. They throw out an arm and they say, what's the idea that's nearest to me that can help me explain this moment of chaos? And what we're trying to do with a book like this is to stock the shelves with better ideas, right? To allow Democrats, for example, to respond to the crises of housing in San Francisco or Los Angeles, or respond to the problem of clean energy construction in Massachusetts, or respond to the general problem of the fact that America invents a lot of shit but can't seem to build it the way that the Chinese can. How do we resolve these observed crises? Well, you reach the ideas that are on the shelf. And abundance is just trying to be on the shelf for those people. So, we are, of course, trying to influence people, but we understand, I think it's clear that no one's ultimately going to vote for a book. The world changes because of people and people filling out institutions, and ultimately that means it's a result of personalities that we can't really directly influence.
Ezra, do you want to take on the, Ezra as America's only real rabbi angle?
What?
I don't know. I felt like I got more good Israel stuff after October 7th from you than anywhere else. We started on one hand doing this very wonky Obamacare stuff, and now we're I don't know. There's a lot of values discussion that you kind of inject into more people's lives than maybe anyone else in the country.
I think I appreciate that. I think the reputation I developed in my Wonk blog days and my Obamacare days as somebody who only cared about the appendix tables and CBO documents was never true.
Okay.
And I do care about the appendix tables and CBO documents and some of the sections that the Derek just described. I believe that you really need the narrow, granular texture of things to understand them. And then I also believe that moments and eras have zeitgeists and values, and I'm probably a little bit more of a mystic than people even exactly realize, although a coming podcast with Ross Douthat, probably out by the time this comes out, is going to rip open the veil on some of that. I try to be honest about my own reaction and struggling with the moments we're in. And like anybody else, my reaction to many of these moments is emotional, and something I believe very strongly about the work I do is that if you aren't making space for that emotional layer of reaction, you are not making space for the reaction itself. And if you can't speak, and you can't speak to everything simultaneously, but if you can't speak to emotionally where the audience is, which is maybe where you are, maybe it's not, it's going to be very hard to get them to listen. If people don't feel understood, they're not going to listen to you, because maybe they shouldn't, actually, by the way. I don't think I'm alone in doing this, but I do think that it has needed a lot of doing. I've always felt, I don't really talk about this much in public. I've always felt as a writer, and maybe a little bit as a person, that the emotional layer of moments it's not that it feels unusually visible to me. It's something that it feels unusually invisible to others. To me, it feels unusually invisible to others. I don't know what it's like to walk through the world and not be incredibly affected by the emotional occurrence of every single room you're in. I meet other people who don't seem to be as overwhelmed by this, and their lives seem blissful to me. But I don't know. It's just a way I experience the world, and I think it just comes out in the show. But when you're writing a piece, and I'd be curious for Derek's reflections on this, because I think he's very good at this too, but when you're writing the piece, of course, or you're doing the podcast, you're writing the intro, I don't know how, just as you have the things the audience believes in your head, right? What am I arguing with? What is the structure of the prevailing sentiment? How the audience is feeling at that moment, particularly in emotions of high sentiment, of high emotion, October 7th, or this period with Donald Trump, but many others besides. Of course, that's part of the structure that you are engaging with. To ignore it. I was never a fan of the Ben Shapiro line, facts don't care about your feelings. Maybe facts don't care, but people sure care. And feelings are also something that sometimes should sensitize us to the idea that there are facts we don't yet know, or an experience we have not yet absorbed. I think it'd be hard to find too many people in journalism more interested in the wonky details of policy than I am. But maybe because I'm so interested in them, I really quite understand that only goes so far. And it also misses a lot. We never have full understanding of anything. We were saying this at the beginning with China. The idea that any of us, anybody in this debate anywhere, anybody in China itself can understand a country that big. I don't understand America. Like, like I think you have to recognize there are many ways of knowing.
I love all of that. I think I agree with just about all of it. What we do, me, Ezra, Jordan, Dan, we make media. And I don't know if the full cash value of media is feelings, but certainly an enormous amount of the cash value of media is feelings. Even when you read a very detailed analysis of some very wonky things. So just the other day, I had a conversation with an astrophysicist about a science that's called transmission spectroscopy, which is the way that we can measure the faraway starlight that passes through planets 100 light years away. And as that light passes through the atmospheres of those planets, we can perform an analysis of the wavelengths that are present in that light to determine which chemicals have blocked aspects of that starlight. And by determining that, we can guess at what chemicals are present in that planet 100 light years away. So we can say, oh, that blur on a telescope, that's ammonia, that's methane, that's dimethyl sulfide. And that means that planet over there 100 million light years away has aquatic life, has algae. Like, the details are technical, but like the cash value is wonder. The cash value is a feeling. And ultimately what I want from people who listen to my podcast or read my work or read this book, it's always nice to hear that someone learned something, right? That the takeaway was informational. That's beautiful. I love learning. I love information. But for me, information feels like something. It feels like a dopamine hit. It feels like the relief of an anxiety that I didn't know something and now I did. Or that my worldview, my Umwelt of what's possible in human life has been expanded by one little unit of a new fact. Right? That's all feeling. And so I feel like emotions are absolutely the cash value of what we do. And ultimately the greatest compliment that I can receive for any of this is, your book made me feel hope. Your podcast made me feel wonder. People were I remember as they were coming up to me and Ezra and we were signing their books. A lot of them said over and over again, you make me feel sane. You help me feel sane, over and over again, as they were talking about our shows, right? That was to them the most honest praise that they had probably thought about in line, thinking, how do I have 5 seconds to talk to this person that I've listened to for 100 to 100,000 hours in my life. What do I say? And the 5 words that came out of their mouth, you make me feel sane, right? You make me feel, right? That's the outcome of the work. And so I think that, I agree with Ezra. Not only are my emotions quite front of mind when I'm writing, but also the emotions of the audience are really front of mind. That's true both within podcasts and across podcasts. Within podcasts, I love a tension between, now we're going into something very deep and now we're scoping up and now we're feeling happy and now there's like a question that's sad. But also across podcasts, I did a lot of shows about how fucking shitty the tariffs were. And I was like, we got to talk about aliens. We have to talk about transmission spectroscopy so that people can get excited about how we can detect alien chemicals in planets that are 100 light years away. Like, we got to go to the other side here. So this play of feelings, this idea that our work sort of exists synonymous to a kind of symphony of feelings within podcasts and across podcasts is extremely, extremely present for me. And it's cool to hear that it's present for Ezra as well.
It's really wonderful that the dulcet tones are getting more fiery. Maybe no one votes for a book, Derek, but I would vote for podcasts. So I would cast a vote for Plain English, and I would cast a vote for the Ezra Klein Show.
All right. Now we got to choose your own adventure here. So, that is lovely, making people feel sane, making people feel heard. But there's also a dark version of abundance if you guys weren't, I think, as you self-describe, pathologically agreeable, where you have sort of like more enemies and villains. I'm curious, like, what that book would look like, what that would kind of like, how that would be embodied. And I guess the other path, if you want to go in a different direction, is like, you kind of answered this in the past 10 minutes, but I'm curious if there are other failure states you see for yourselves over the next 5 or 10 years that you're kind of like worried about and trying to orient away from when it comes to what you guys do.
Maybe I'll take the first one, the dark abundance question.
Okay.
I feel like people kept telling Derek particularly that he's too agreeable, but they tell me that too. And Matt Iglesias had this funny reaction to the book where he said, I read this book and I thought it was good, but I thought it was too agreeable. Nobody would argue over it. And it was too soft. And then everybody argued over it. So maybe I was wrong. One thing I have come to learn on the tour and in the reaction is that I have a more different sense of how one should treat coalitional politics than many people I agree with, both to my right and to my left. Which is to say that other people seem a little bit more certain that you can create a group, right? Call that group corporations, call that group unions, call that group, whatever. And the thing you're doing in politics is really deciding, is that an in-group or an out-group? And if it's an out-group, you should be attacking it much more. They're your villain. And if it's an in-group, you should really be allying with them. They're your partner. And I view this much more situationally. Environmentalists, unions, corporations, name your interest group, name your constituency. And it just seems to me, one, that these are very, very big, diverse categories themselves, which have a lot of internal fractiousness. As if you've ever reported on them, you know that, and I have reported on all of them. So that's one thing. And then two, there's just going to be different issues that have different structures of coalitions. And so it's not that I think the book doesn't have, I guess, sort of quote unquote villains, although I don't think we think many of the people we're talking about in the book are ill-intentioned. But the book has plenty of instances where you can see who is standing in the way of the thing we want, or governing in a way we don't want, or, and that's led a lot of people to get angry. But what I've found when I talk to people who are maybe more, a little bit centrist than me, the thing I get a lot of is, well, aren't public interest unions your real enemy? Mm-hmm. And on the left, the fight has been more like, when will you admit that corporations and corporate power are the real enemy?
Yeah, and I guess that's just not interesting.
I'm not going to say it's not interesting. I've been preparing to do a conversation with Zephyr Teachout and someone else that's going to reflect some of this. And I've been reading her work and thinking a lot about how much she sort of sees the end point as power itself, right? Her sort of critique of a lot of the people she's arguing with in many, many different domains is they're focusing on X, but they're not focusing on power. And there's, I think, a sense that if you could move power over here, then that would be great. We would sort of have solved the problem. But then what if the power over here is used poorly, right? I mean, I think you can look at a lot of, and I think her confidence, and I shouldn't say too much on this because I'm going to do the show and I want to hear what she says on it. But I think sometimes her confidence is that if you moved the power from, I guess the corporations in one case over to, say, the government, the power would be well used. And maybe sometimes it would be well used, but oftentimes maybe it wouldn't be well used. Government gets captured by lots of different groups and not just corporations. Or similarly, right, a lot of the new left move power from the government to individuals and planning meetings and people who can bring a lawsuit. And the assumption was that, of course, the individuals are going to be a safer place to put power than the government. And they should, tie the government up in process. And sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not true. And so I think that there isn't this, a lot of people seem to have the view that there was some secret abundance, a Straussian version of abundance written in the back of our minds. And that in that version of abundance, we're extremely clear, who we want to execute. And that due to our agreeable nature, we either edited that out at the end or mentally edited out at the beginning. And a lot of abundance is an argument about being outcome oriented and having this question, what do we need more of and how do we get it? And then being really rigorous about the answer. And sometimes that will lead you to, hey, there have been a series of sort of corporate interventions here that have kept us from getting what we need. Or, in other places it's local homeowners, or in other places it's environmental groups, or there are places where unions are using environmental laws for reasons that have nothing to do with the environment, but they've made the environmental law a very potent tool of delay. And now we can't change the environmental law, in California, because they are so committed to their ability to leverage it that they don't want anything to happen to it, even though it is blocking all these other things we need for other reasons. So there isn't this dark abundance book sitting somewhere. I don't think we have the luxury of believing there is some stable equilibria of interest that gets us what we want. It's more about believing that we should be very, very, very committed to achieving the things we promise. And that if the reason we are not achieving the things we promise is this or that group, well, then on that issue, they're not our allies. And, you should be trying to overcome that problem.
I want to ground Ezra's principles in this news moment because I think they're so appropriate. A lot of times when I talk with folks on the left or when I'm interrogated by folks from the left, I was just on Mehdi Hasan's show the other day, and he asked me a version of this point. Why isn't your book more anti-corporate? Why isn't it more anti-billionaire, more anti-oligarchical? And I wish I had this framing that I don't see business as the permanent outgroup of progressivism. And I also don't see the government as necessarily the singular appropriate wielder of democratic interests. Look at what's happening right now. You have a government that's trying to take away the independence of the Federal Reserve. Trump has bragged about using his tariff policy to try to crash the stock market. And they're using government power in order to entirely reshape the economy in a way that's been terrible for manufacturing. And it's Wall Street that's coming in and begging Scott Bessent to keep the Fed independent, to not crash the economy, and to take away these tariffs in ways that will protect the manufacturing sector. If your first principle is that if Wall Street asks for it, then it's bad, then you put yourself in the position of questioning things like the independence of the Federal Reserve, or questioning the idea that one shouldn't try to junk the stock market by just raising tariffs randomly on various countries. So I think that in many ways, it's much more helpful to recognize that in groups and out groups, these aren't universals, they are situational. And it's better to reason from the first principles of politics rather than to assign entire groups as on side versus enemy. So I really do think that I hope that that's something that came across in the book, both for better and for worse, that we are really, I'm really against trying to designate entire groups perma-enemies of progress, because economics is complicated and life is complicated, and sometimes people are on both sides of it.
All right, we're going to speed it up. I'm going to ask you 5 different questions about hosting podcasts. You guys pick whichever one you want to do. Do you have magic words pre-recording to give as like a pep talk to folks? What's going through your heads when you're interviewing? Tricks to turn around guests that are kind of like a B- for the first 10 minutes. What are you working on as interviewers? And are there any ideas for content or just like initiatives or ways you'd spend your time if you guys weren't affiliated with large outlets that you're not doing today?
Let me answer the general question, sort of lumping some of these questions into meta questions. One is how I think about shepherding guests that aren't giving me exactly what I want in that moment. And then another is, actually, that's the one that I really want to take.
Okay, great.
Is because it's a really, really tough question, right? Sometimes you can feel like the conversation is sort of slipping out of your hands. I'm never afraid to simply step up and say, hey, can we go back to the very first question? This is on me. I think I understand how to work our way through this conversation, and I'm going to ask a different set of questions. But if you want to play with me here, let's do ABC. So I try to be relatively explicit about what I want if I feel like the conversation isn't going the way that I want. And a lot of that for the purpose of not making the guest feel like it's on them, and then they get self-conscious, and then they've got this sort of like metacognitive layer of thought that's constantly judging their thinking, and so they can't actually be expressive and interesting and fluent. I try to blame it on myself and say, let's try essentially a new game, right? We played game number 1. Let's play game number 2 and see how it goes. That's kind of like how I like to massage the conversation. And then in terms of the guidance that I give them, I don't want to be overly prescriptive. Ezra and I were actually talking earlier about another podcaster who is unusually prescriptive at the beginning of one of his interviews. I don't like to be overly prescriptive. I want to hear their natural personality come through, but I'd like to remind them, especially if they're in very technical fields, this is a podcast for a generalist audience. I want you to use jargon, because jargon I think actually sounds cool. But I want you to slow down and explain everything that doesn't feel like a 101 in a class that you might teach. So that I'm getting them to at least, as they're beginning to talk about, transmission spectroscopy, understand, wow, that was super multisyllabic. I'm definitely going to want to slow down there. So I want it to be slow. I want it to be conversational. I want it to feel like a little bit of a conversation after, half a beer. But I tend to not give them like that level of specificity.
I think if something's not working, you have to try something else. And the more it's not working, the more radically you have to try something else. And I don't think I always succeed at this. It's very hard to get out of the map you had in your head for the conversation. Sometimes you're just sort of hoping that things will catch later, and then you will edit out the beginning. Sometimes I just will have a beginning. I'm like, well, we're throwing away the first 12 minutes of that one.
Yeah.
But I do think that you have to start trying just riskier strategies and trying to knock people off where they are. The thing that's really tough is when a guest is just clamming up. When it turns out that on the mic, they're not willing to be as open as maybe they were with you in other reporting, or they're just nervous, or then, to some degree, you sometimes have to rescue them. But, usually there's a way to find a conversational vein that activates them. And I think it's being very sensitive to people's energy in the moment.
Aside from having a better one-line takeaway for what people should think about China, other feedback for ChinaTalk? What should we be doing more here?
I do think that I learned so much from your Substack and your show. Sometimes I feel like there's a historical layer that I always feel like I appreciate to understand like how things got to where they are. And I think maybe sometimes people who are expert in a particular domain, they forget that other people might want to walk the path that they walked to arrive at that moment of relative expertise. And so I'm always a fan, and maybe this is just my general preference for, explainer media, but I'm always a fan of stepping back and doing a little bit of the how we got to here. So I don't know if that's as much a criticism as an observation, but that's just a type of media that I always appreciate.
Can really never have too much Dan Wang.
He's been the one on the on the island. Anything else, Ezra?
That was my feedback.
Well, look, like it comes back to something earlier, right? Like your show's called Plain English, and I feel like I'm more in the Dwarkesh mindset of like, I'm just going to do this thing and I'm going to do it at my level, and like you'll get 80% of it, and like if you want you can Google things, like there's this ChatGPT now can fill in the gaps for you, but I don't know, I hear that. All right, so Ezra, I went back to this Tim Ferriss interview you did, and you spoke really nicely about how Matt Iglesias giving you like an attaboy when you were 19 was a big sort of psychological booster to like continue down this like very weird path at writing stuff on the internet. I want to, maybe all three of us to kind of take some time to just do that for people in public, folks, in the like sub 10,000 Substack follower range who we think are doing a good job. So I'll start. Jasmine's son, who's just like very like weird and offbeat sort of China, a little bit of Asia. She went to Taiwan recently, but like I think is taking a really interesting look at technology writing. Andrew Stokels, who's writing this Substack called Sina Cities, which is a exploration about regions in China. There's so much focus on Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen that exploring sort of what's happening out in all the other provinces is really cool. Kyle Chan, if you like, if you want to have someone who like actually dives deep into what Huawei and BYD are doing in the broader sort of like industrial Chinese ecosystem, I think he can be a better shepherd than, say, a Tom Friedman. And lastly, John Sine. He publishes a little more rarely, but these deep dives into Chinese economic policy and communist ideology, both in the Soviet Union, I think are really, and China, I think are really good. Let's go around the horn. Who wants to shout out some names there?
I have only one nomination, and that is Jordan Schneider of ChinaTalk. I think he brings a level of enthusiasm into making a quite boring topic much more broadly accessible. Today we heard not only from the mystical aspect of Ezra, but also about Starlight from Derek. And that is not, you don't expect that going into ChinaTalk, but that's what you're going to get.
Yeah, to be honest, though, having done a book with Derek, you can't get this guy to shut up about Starlight. Comes up much more. There was a beautiful star stuff passage. I don't think ended up in the book, though. I don't actually know why. I think it's because we took out some of the nuclear stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, Derek, it's like, give that guy 30 minutes, you're gonna hear about Starlight. I'll shout out Henry Farrell, whose programmable mutter Substack is just completely essential. I think people should always be reading Henry. He's like one of the great minds of our time. Jen Paulka, I think her Substack is called Eating Policy, but it's just much more in the weeds of like how policy actually works in practice than just about anybody else is. And then Don Moynihan, who's a professor, an expert in administrative law and administrative complexity. I don't remember offhand what his Substack is called. Somebody can probably Google it. But Don Moynihan is just like very, very, very good on those topics similarly.
I second Henry Farrell. He is I think of Henry as a giant intellectual teddy bear. And anytime I see Henry, all I want to do is grab him on my arms and squeeze.
My two recommendations are from the world of science, Saloni Datani and Ruxandra Teslo, both really exquisite writers and wonderful thinkers on genetics and innovation and culture and how science actually works. I am incredibly interested in so many different frontiers of science right now, and always open to people who are desperate, honestly, hungry for people who can make it plain for me and make it stick. And they're both wonderful at what they do.
All right, we end every episode with a song. What's the one that best captures abundance?
Ooh, I don't think I have an answer to what song best captures abundance.
I'm so disappointed.
Derek, do you?
Yeah.
Thank God.
Max Richter's recomposition of Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Abundance is many things. Vivaldi's Four Seasons is all four of the seasons. And Richter gives it a beautiful Baroque quality to it. And I believe that the future should be not only efficient, but also Baroque.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you so much for being